although they will still tell you this ironic story of, I just want my kid to have a happy and free life.
Yes.
But all of what they did is not really aiming on that,
Yes.
right? It is almost the opposite.
Hello, welcome to our Common Concerns podcast. I'm Xiang Biao, a co-director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Saale, Germany. This podcast is a part of our effort to develop a common concerns approach. What is a common concerns approach? It is an analytical strategy with which we want to do a type of research that at the end, we can go back to our interlocutors to tell them what we found out, what we think, what kind of concepts we come up, or what kind of more questions we raise. And then our interlocutors say, oh, this sounds interesting, and this is something that have bothered me for quite a while, but I have not thought of them in this way. And by thinking of this way, as you, researchers, suggested, I feel that I see more things in the life, and I feel that I can see things more clearly. And therefore, I feel probably I can try to do more things in my life in the given circumstances that I'm in, even though I cannot change the whole circumstances itself. We propose to develop a common concerns approach because we realized that in the 21st century, the context under which we do research is very different from even 20 or 30 years ago. Today, the massification of higher education means that the public, especially in the global south, are much better educated than before. And with the unprecedentedly developed communication technologies, they have easy access to all kinds of information, and as also they have a very easy way to express their opinions. So young people have many questions in their life, but they are not asking simple answers. If we as experts or researchers tell them some answers, they were not going to take them. And they may be very suspicious about the answers that the experts provide. Instead, they demand concepts, perspectives that they can use to think of their questions in their own way. And this is what we try to deliver. So therefore, in a sense, ideally, the common concerns approach is an exercise to think together with our interlocutors. So it's not only a research exercise carried out by the researchers in a one-way manner. So in our department, most of existing research projects started well before we proposed the notion of a common concerns approach. So every day in the department, researchers bang our heads together to think, okay, can this approach be applied to projects that started a while ago, in which in some cases the field work have already been completed? Is it possible to bring this analytical angle into the data and reinterpret the data and to see something that is already there, but we did not see before, and therefore to develop concepts that can speak to these people rather than speak about them? And so this is our daily conversations. And today, I'm very pleased to have my colleague, researcher Siqi, to join me to discuss precisely that. And Siqi has worked on her project for a number of years. Actually, now I understand it's probably the last stage of writing up. So it is a very interesting moment to test whether this approach is useful in your case. Yeah. Siqi, could you please tell us about your research first? What is about, whom you study with?
Yeah. Thank you so much for this introduction. And I really consider our conversation today as an exercise trying to see whether we can use common concerns approach as an analytical tool to try to in some way re-enter my research. So the fieldwork of this research initially, the earliest version of it almost happened a decade ago now.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Okay.
I know. I cannot believe that.
But you have historical depth.
Yeah,
now.
I know. I cannot believe that. But I've been following, a group of students who upper middle class urban families in China who decided to send their children to the U.S. for private high schools. So the majority of people, when I talk to, they are more or less either in college or in the later stage of their life right now. But when I started this research, I'm curious why people, these families are willing to spend so much money, $500,000 or even more US dollars to send their kids away, thousands of miles away to, be as teenagers, to be away from their parents and continue their studies in American private school setting. So that was the initial question for me, like why, the imbalance of investment and emotional distance from their own families.
So your subject are mainly the parents.
I study all different actors in the field. So it's parents, students, and educational consultants who kind of facilitate this process. So I talk to all actors. In rare cases, some teachers talk to me, but they are not the most important part of the research. But it's multi-sided because, it's a transnational setting by default. So I talk to many parents in China, so Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing, major cities. And I talk to many students in the US when they were on their Thanksgiving trip to New York City, or sometimes it's via video chat because all those private schools are located dispersely in everywhere in the States. There's no way that I can travel to their schools. So it is by nature a multi-sided, multiplayer ethnographic research. I participate in a lot of, the students' activities, and I go to those educational consultants firm when they have those writing camps and those, summer gatherings and stuff. So I hang out with the students and sometimes their consultants. And sometimes I go to, if I got lucky, I got invited to their family's home. Then I talk to the students and parents in the same setting. So it's very different. The parents and students don't necessarily match because not everyone wants to introduce their parents or their children to me. So, but in general, I talked to over 100 people within this whole scene, and I follow many of them for a really long time. Although the follow-up are relatively brief. It's just, what you're doing now. And so I have a sense of, how they turn out to be, especially at this more, current trend, always shifting geopolitical moments.
Especially between US and China.
Especially between US and China. First COVID, and then, the worsening US-China relationship. So lots of moving pieces within this process.
Okay. If we leave the common concern approach aside for a moment, so what is the main conclusions or insights or the most interesting thing that emerged from your research so far?
So I was trying to argue this idea of a fragile cosmopolitanism is because I think all these families embark a journey to try to create a global citizen, try to provide a quote-unquote best education available in the world to their children. And with the idea of embracing globalization, the U.S. being, the top player of this world, that their children will be, on the peak of this whatever hierarchy that the parents and the students understand it is. And it turned out it's a way more complicated picture, of course, especially with the students' experience of, this typical racialization process when you enter the U.S. and became an other, not a mainstream anymore. But still, privilege in a sense, in an economic sense. So I'm trying to grapple with all these contradictions. And at the end, this historical moment of all these other things happening, COVID and US-China relationship. So it feels like this imagined, rather neoliberal idea of cosmopolitanism doesn't really exist for them, because at the end of the day, it's pretty much determined by, your passports, your family wealth, where you feel safer. So lots of, pre-understood advantages of these education are gradually, fading away. So I'm trying to capture that moment of the fragility of this, global imaginaries and how it eventually turned out to be or is still evolving in the process.
Okay. if I understand it correctly, by fragile, you mean the journey of pursuing this cosmopolitan global citizenship is very complicated. And but do you also imply that the parents or the children's imagination and commitment and faith in the cosmopolitanism is also not that firm or the fragile? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good understanding. So I think for me, the settling on the word fragile is because it's almost feel like everything is uncertain in the process. But then you also feel like there are some certainty in it that people are chasing. I mean, with our department's language, we'll probably say it's a fantasy, right? People are chasing something that you keep thinking.
So fantasy is quite stable.
Yeah, I think it's like, because I think for the parents, there is a global imaginaries because we need to remember there are different generations, right? The parents are mostly born in the 60s, 70s. So they are, the beneficiaries of China's economic and opening up. So they, are beneficiaries of this idea of globalization, China entering WTO, all these kind of things. So the belief and this idea of the worlds are connected, and you should go to the U.S. as the top player to get better resources for their kids. So I think they believe in this American equal the world kind of imaginaries. So they talk about global citizen and talk about international education, but essentially, in some way, the reality what they could have is a very provincialized version of American education, right? It was sent to a suburban American school. So that defines the kind of education, the kind of environment their children end up being. So, but I think there is a certain gap between what you imagine it to be, which is a very grand and global.
Yeah, abstract.
And abstract. And what the everyday experience of their children. And I think the children also felt feeding to certain imaginaries of, what they want to be, the elitism that was selling to them, right? This whole idea of New England, landscape, the kind of elite boarding school kind of imaginaries that they were fed into. And some students will talk to me, oh, I live in a global village, right? So they also live in sometimes boarding school is a total institution. So sometimes it's a bubble where you see all the international students around you as a diversity of the world, right? So there are very different experiences for various students because each school is different. But then they have certain imaginaries that was sold to them when they onboard this journey. So I think that part is shifting for students by their everyday experience. But when they started it, there are certain things that they were seeking. At the end of journey, I think sometimes they're not sure about it anymore. And I think I probably have shared with you in the past, what surprised me the most when I was doing the research many years ago, not now, was the high schoolers keep telling me they're going to return to China after.
So the people who did primary or junior high school in China, but they went to the US when they're 15.
Yeah, so but when they talk to me, they're more like 18 to 20, right? So they were in the middle of high school or early college years when some of them talked to me. And they all, like not all, but many of them, majority of them told me that they're going to return to China.
That was which year?
It was more like 2015 to 2017. At that time, I don't believe them. I was like, okay, you're just a teenager, you're going to spend 10 years of U.S. education, right? It's 4 years of high school and then going to be 4 years of college. And the majority of them will add 2 or 3 more years of advanced degree. So I think you're going to spend 10 years in the States. I don't believe that you're going to return to China right after all of this, right? You basically spend a majority of your adulthood and in the States that then you tell me you're returning to China. So at that time, I thought it was just because they were frustrated by, being new in the country, trying to accepting their status of becoming a minority rather than the mainstream in China. But eventually, I think I was somewhat wrong, right? Because COVID happened and the geopolitics situation keep changing. Many of them did return. And there is some political economy behind it as well, because, they come from pretty wealthy background. So returning to China actually does make sense for them, that their family will provide more security network for them. They will feel more like financially stable, and the parents can have more social capital within China that can maybe get them a job or even just provide them some comfort and cheap labor, all these things, right? They can actually live more like a upper middle class or rich person when they're in China. So that was something that I didn't realize when I was, doing the research. Because I think I entered with a more laser focus on education itself. Then I would think, okay, if you're doing 10 years of education here, you're going to, use this knowledge in the States, find a job. At least you're going to stay a couple of more years until you can go back to China. And at that point, who's going to go back to China with all the lack of Chinese knowledge, right? So, but then I realized it is not so true for this specific, interesting socioeconomic background of students, that it does make sense for some of them to do eventually choose to do that. Yeah.
Does this also mean that these students do not develop much local friendship or some identification with a local lifestyle or cultural thing? Because one reason that we assume that since you spend your teenager time here, you'll be in love with the music or in love with a sports thing, and you have lots of friends, including romantic friends, so make you difficult just to live like that. But doesn't mean actually their life are rather isolated in the US.
Yeah, that depends. And I have to say, although I have been painting the surprising fact for me, there are still a strand of these students who are staying, right? I think in my mind, it's interesting. It's always, I guess I didn't really, haven't really thought this through, but in some way, I think there is something related to their political spectrum of, how they were changed by this, I guess, liberalism or the idea that where they're standing on their thoughts. Because those who study social sciences, for example, are more likely to stay in the States because lots of them embrace issues on social justice and things like that. They might be more into trying to pursue a career outside of China, because it's a bit rather hard to go back to China to try to do that. Or they don't have the local resources to go back China to do that, while others are more likely to, try to leverage the advantage, maybe a US degree, and go back to China. But I'm not answering your earlier question about friendship. I think it is interesting. Lots of them are, by the many years they're staying in the States, many cultivated local friendship. But another interesting fact is also because they have, when I studied this phenomenon, the triggering point is actually the increasing number of people who are doing this. So there is a critical mass of Chinese students doing this together. So I think they have cultivated deep friendship with people who have very similar experience than them. So they're also not friends with people back in China, right? Because they cannot hang out, many of them can no longer hang out with their primary school friends or junior high friends who spend their entire life in China. So they have a very small strand of friendship groups who have similar experience, who didn't necessarily go to the same schools, but they all they have a similar experience of going to American high school and then maybe college, blah, 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 together. So in many cases, and with the advancement with now technology, there's WeChat group of, maybe American high school students from China who live in the Northeast region. Then they can hang out together, they can play, they can go to have their bubble tea in New York, right? Have other, go on other maybe ski trip in Vermont, those kind of things. So they can organize group activities, but that also means it is kind of like, I guess, the equivalent of sometimes when we study expats, right? You have a circle of friends who are also floating with you. So you don't necessarily have local grounding.
That's very interesting. You called it a fragile cosmopolitanism, but in the end, there is lots of up and downs, frustration and disappointment. But it seems that you have not observed some backlash. For instance, some people suddenly became very nationalistic or right-wing, become the opposite of cosmopolitanism. They are fragile, but nevertheless stay cosmopolitan in the end.
A small strand. I wouldn't say that's common. Some became more nationalistic. And I think I actually wrote it in one of the chapters. Probably I said it's more like reactive ethnicity or something, right? You became Chinese only when you're abroad, that kind of narrative. So you don't feel like you're that Chinese when you're China,
more situational.
Right, but when you were brought into a situation, sometimes it's understandable because you experience racism or you first, I guess, the storylines goes first you go to the States and suddenly you became Asian because you will never feel yourself to be an Asian, right? It is a new category for students outside of their, motherland. And then they're like, okay, now others read you as Asian. So now I'm Asian or now I'm international students. And some students reject these type of label and then they will say, I'm Chinese, right? So, and then there is a nationalistic and patriotic elements to it. And sometimes it is a fight back for the racism. They will say, okay, China is, better than US right now. China is, number one on GDP these days. And then lots of them will also tell me that China is where growth is at. So there is a dose of nationalistic sentiment for some of them. I do have a specific case of student who actually went back to top universities in China to do his advanced degrees. So it is, I think, rather unusual among, the many people that I talked to, but there are cases of people realize, okay, maybe eventually my advantage is at, to try to achieve more elite status within China rather than trying to become nobody in an American setting.
Yeah, now if you think of a common concern approach, do you think it will add anything?
Yeah, I think that's the question that I grappled with, especially when we were talking about speak to and speak about. I actually didn't really know what my interlocutor, the students, can actually learn from, the kind of concept that I'm creating, the kind of observation that I had. Although I did give book talks within, in China in some bookstores, and there are some students who had this kind of experience attending the talk, and they tell me they're really moved. But I think the moving part is more like they feel seen. They feel like this is my experience. I'm glad someone write about it and capture it vividly. But I didn't know whether it really, provide them new tools to think about their life. It's more like, this is me. And I'm glad that someone see the contradictory, see all these, struggles that I personally went through. And some of them will say, I wish you, write this book eventually in Chinese so I can show it to my parents so they understand what I went through. Because apparently it's something that is very hard to articulate for someone who didn't understand this whole process. And I think it's also common that that's a more like slight methodological notes is a lot of the students, when they talk to me, they will say, I've never, discussed this with anyone else because I cannot share my miseries with my parents. They will be worried. You don't want to bother your friends sometimes. So it seems like, they're really willing to talk to me in some cases because they don't have other venues to really talk about their struggles and vulnerabilities in this process. And maybe no one asked them, what do you feel about being abroad alone, away from parents, blah, blah, blah.
But that's very interesting because we're talking about the speak about and speak to as a very simplified binary. But in the scenario that you just described, actually you combine both because the book is meant to be speak about. You are not thinking of speaking to explicitly. But the students are now using your research to speak to their parents. So they want you to speak to their parents, even though it is mediated, brokered by them. So then you must capture something that concerns the students, yet they don't have a language to express, as you just alluded to. But is what kind of thing you think you can think of? It is certain, for instance, a fear of disappointment. Because the students, end up in the middle of nowhere in the US. Obviously, it's very different from the parents told them, but yet they feel they cannot tell the parents how disappointed they are because they know how much investment the parents has put in. So therefore, they have that kind of, I have to always, I should never disappoint my parents. Something like that. What do you think the students want to? Why the student want to show your book to the parents?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I've been thinking about this because I wasn't sure whether I was thinking about whether it is some quote unquote failures, because I was thinking maybe no one, because I actually previously I wrote about success frame, how they're creating different successful frames for themselves so they can, make sense of what they're doing. But I think recently I was also thinking maybe there are certain angle of the reversing is whether there are failed promises, failures, because it's probably inspired by our workshop on wants and their shadows, right? We're thinking the negative sides of these things. Because I think previously when we were talking about education, I was mainly thinking about, global aspiration, right? The success that these education are supposed to signal. But then usually it's more complicated than that. It's all the frustration and failures that you encountered during these process, and it's not what you learn at school, right? So it's not technically education per se, but it's what is happening within this field of education. And then your life happens, and all these other things actually are more or less frustration to be the least, right? So I think maybe that is the part which is hard to convey, because I think no one will, I asked lots of them, quote unquote, is it worth it, right? Of course, it's a stupid question, but it's a conversation starter. And I think many of them will tell me, and I think there is certain thing very Chinese in it. They will say, although it's really hard, but if I can do, you ask me again, I will still do it.
And this is the students.
The students. And sometimes I actually ask them a trick question. I didn't ask, will you do it? I asked them,
would you send your children?
Yes. I asked them, if you have a kid, would you send your children to go through this journey? And some of them will say, yes, I still think I will do that, although it's extremely hard. But I think they still see certain merits of the education that they're having. So, and I think that education is more the schooling part of it. Maybe the degrees, maybe the content that they're learning. And of course, the flip side is the Chinese education, which is hyper-focused on tests and all these things. That's the major reason many of them decided to escape that system. Right. So if you're comparing these two, I think many of them will still say, I would still want to do it. But then they also are willing to talk about the emotional costs. And I think for some of them probably will not do it that early. Because I think the central piece of my research is still why people are doing this so early, right? Because the comment is probably you do it at graduate school level or even at undergrad level, but not as teenagers. So I think a lot of them will still doubting whether it's worth it to be sent alone outside on their own so early on. That is a question mark for many of them. And I think that's the part I realized also many parents didn't realize, because I remember that was also a little bit shocking for me. One of the mom that I talked to, she said I was so focusing on getting my daughter into a top boarding school that I didn't think about how she's going to live there. So the moment I sent her away, she said, I start to think, oh, how is she going to, go to bathroom when there's like a transit flight? I was like, wow, that's so interesting. So you were laser focusing on this educational part of it. Maybe, so let's say it's the degree part of it, right? Which school you're getting to, whether the school provides very good education, a Renaissance, became a Renaissance person, whatever, right? But then there's other elements, right? The dormitory life, whether your kids can make friends, how they're going to live, how they're going to wash their clothes, right?
Yeah.
Are they capable of doing this? So all these things sometimes came secondary, and it's not the parents don't care about their kids, but they don't think about it until they're gone.
Yeah.
And then they start to be very worried about their kids. They cannot sleep. They
Yes.
keep their phone on all the time.
Yes.
They track their kids through their credit card payments. But it came secondary. So it's not that they don't care about it, but when they were preparing for it, they don't think about it. So I think that might be something quote unquote historical as well, in a sense that when there are more people doing it and more people sharing their experience, maybe they'll start to, the generation behind them will think about it. And they're probably not going to be in this, I'm only focusing on the school element of the story. Yeah.
And can you tell us what's the answer you find for your original question? Why so early?
I think many people will tell me, so this question usually are posed to the parents.
Yeah.
Because you cannot ask children why you do this so early. They more or less because they're so young, so it's mainly still a family decision and mainly a parent's decision. And I think that really many of them will tell you all these reasons of, I don't want them to go through Gaokao. Right, this high school entrance, the college entrance exam, that's super competitive. That's, there's so many works out there talking about why the test-oriented system is quite toxic in its own way. So many of them, and many of these parents went through this process themselves. So they don't want their kids to go through this. And some of them also cite more political reason, right? They don't want to be, have all those, political education around certain languages, right? Sometimes you read specific, you need to recite certain political texts that they're really not into. For example, one parent told me that, she said, I was shocked when my kids was reciting something, let's all circle around Chairman Xi's, rim or something. She was like, this reminds me of Mao and all these kind of things. And I went through that as a kid. I don't want my kid to going through that process. So I think that story is a classical push and pull story that they think they are choosing the better option. The Chinese local option for them is not good enough, and they think the American option is, better in many sense. And in some way, content-wise, it is more well-rounded, right? They can have sports, they can have arts, they can have all these different, philosophical texts if their kids are really, into all of this. So there are a version of it that is really nice. And that's the version that they're aiming for, and they think you need to send your kids there earlier so you can speak English faster, right? It's still young, so you learn quickly, blah blah blah. So then there are, I think in some cases there are family reasons, the father remarry, and then this is a child from the previous wife, then you need to send the kids away. So there are complicated reasons. But the major reason is still educational. It is still people think, or these parents believe that this is a better education. And I think there is also a neoliberal elements in it. Is the educational market in China was quite chaotic at that time because parents have all these choices all of a sudden. Because before, when they were going to high schools, there's no choice, right? You either go to the school nearby, or maybe there is a certain exam, then you get to quote unquote better schools by exam scores. But when I was talking to these people, there are private schools within China, international schools within China. Then you can go through the traditional, public school route by doing the zhongkao, right? This exams, and then you can also try to go to international class within public schools. So there's all these different choices, and it overwhelmed them. And in some cases, they are also, really newly wealthy. So they tend to choose the most expensive option available. And American boarding school is the most expensive option among all of these. So there might be a slight element of conspicuous consumption, but I wouldn't say that's the major drive. but there's definitely a class thing that other people are doing this, so maybe I should think about it, and I can't afford it, so maybe that's the better option. So I think there's definitely a class element within it, but that is not, I guess, the only reason why they're doing it. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting because you can see the contradiction here. Parents wanted to send the kids early. Actually, it's not for the degree concerns. Actually, they want to send the kids early, as you said. It's more for human development. You know, they wanted the kids to receive the reasonable and proper education as early as possible. But at the same time, the way they do it is very much engineered and packaged. And I think it's very typical among the people whom I interview too. When they think of life, they rarely think of contextually they don't think of the circumstances of life. They think of life is just a one-line project. You know?
Exactly.
There's a goal and you have to manage. It's like running a project. So it's not like a rounded situation of life. And I think that could be a kind of common concerns topic. You know, this particular way of imagining life. You want a success and a genuine success. You not only from degree but also on the person. But yet somehow you imagine it as a project-like rather than a life unfolding in very specific circumstances. And then earlier, what you mentioned, it was quite touching. It's about failure. The experience of failure or danger of failure and the near impossibility to narrate about the failure in a situation that everything is about success, because the only language available to them is the language of success, or heroically try hard to reach success. But then you think, what do you think is a value or limitation of a common concerns approach, looking from your own research as an example? You think what could help you now, or what actually is difficult?
Yeah, I think I always have a little bit trouble of thinking with common concerns approach on this particular project, is because I do think this is a rather privileged group of people. And sometimes I have trouble to think, what kind of abstraction we can get from it that is common, and that I've been struggling with this question of common for quite a while, because I feel like, in certain classification, people will say this is elite studies. You're studying the elites, so they're wealthy, they have resources, and they have money none of us can imagine to have. So what is the point of understanding their success and failures when the common people will never be able to afford this kind of education? So I think initially, when I was doing this research, of course, I was thinking from this, global reproduction of a certain class, right? So what do this tell us about class inequality? But then that's not that interesting, right? It's an old story. There's nothing new in this particular strand of story. So I think for me, the trouble of thinking through common concern approach probably is about the amount of wealth is involved in the process. And I think I do have certain trouble of thinking whether, of course, I know the experiential part, the emotional part is real, but I'm not sure whether that's relevant enough to be carried away, to be portable eventually, that other people can think about it. Or it is more a story of, okay, let's understand the quote-unquote global elites and how they move around the world, and then what do we learn more about the global system that we're embedded in.
I think that's very interesting, because you pointed two strategies here to make a case study relevant to larger analysis, right? One strategy you said it's more conventional and less interesting, but I think it's still quite important, is that is a strategy of location. You say, that's the elite, they occupy particular position in the global reproduction of inequality. And then a description of how this group of people mobilize resources and how they are related to other part of education system does tell us something about the world. Surely, I think there is a value. And the second way to articulate the relevance of the case study is the common concerns approach is not through location. I mean, location is still important as a background. Of course, we have to say it is indeed. But the real relevance comes from the experiential and emotional resonance and through understanding of some existential questions they face. I'm really, this is a brainstorming. I'm thinking of example. For instance, what I see in your story is a, you can say it actually is quite common in China that the people try to lead a life according to quite a well scripted and of course optimistic and a very future oriented vision. And then the vision is so strong. It is strong because it is collectively shared. Many people do that. That I think is for migrant workers I worked with and delivery riders. They all have that kind of the future and a very strong vision. And then they always have a concern how to lead their day-to-day life under such a vision. This vision gives them, of course, lots of incentives, gives them sense of hope and meaning, and etc. But constantly, their everyday life is judged, assessed against this vision. So many people feel quite tired, and some people really have deep doubt about their own being, everyday life. And then in my own work, I also talk about the suspension, because then you just don't want to look at everyday. I mean, my case is adult and the migrant workers and the taxi driver, etc. They say, okay, even health, it's for future. In my own health, I will suspend the essential part of my life, and then so it's continue my life to kind of ration towards the imagined vision, and now this problem become even more acute because the vision somehow is moved further and further away because of economic stagnation, because of the global uncertainty, and etc. If we think of that is a kind of common concern, namely how to lead a life under a very strong vision, as we talk about the failure case, there's no language or no image around that enable you to express frustration on the failure and the setback and etc. Would that be a possible topic? Then we would see, the anxiety of the parents. They want to, or even impatience, want to try to get done as quickly as possible. And we can see the frustration or self-suppression of the children when they live life in this vision, etc. Would that be possible? You think there is not very feasible?
No, I think that's actually really interesting, because I was also just thinking what you said earlier about, how you were trying to engineer a certain life,
Yes.
right? And I think it is, particularly in the case of China, or maybe globally, is like the more resources you have, the more likely you can engineer a life,
Very
right? Because if
interesting.
you're under-resourced, then you cannot plan your life.
You just live your life.
Right? you live a precarious life, then you cannot plan what I'm going to do in the next year.
Yeah.
But when I was talking to these families,
Yeah.
they are really programming life in a very particular way, right?
Yeah.
Especially the most prepared group, they start to prepare what the pre-K is about, right? They have English tutor, native English speakers as tutor when their kids were very, very young. So it is a very, very pre-programmed life, which tired me when I was doing field work, because it's so tiring when I talk to them. The amount of work that they put into their kids' education, the amount of resources they put into their kids' education.
It's even exhausting for you to listen
for
to.
me to talk to them, you know? It's like, oh my goodness. The kind of thinking that you're having, although it also feels like the abundance of resources you have, right? You're willing to pay, even in 2015, 17, you're willing to pay, say, $100 per hour for a tutor to tutor your kids, whatever, very easy stuff, right? I was like, wow, this is like, that's the amount of resources you're willing to put into kids' education. So in a way, I think that is very true when we're talking about, engineered, programmed life. And I think in a way, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you have a very programmed life, it's very likely you're going to fail.
Yes.
Because things normally don't go as planned.
Yes.
Right?
Yet the failure will, sound so scary because it's so engineered.
And I think it is. I think that's actually a really good angle for me to think about it, because I was always thinking why I feel so anxious when I was talking to these parents specifically. Because they never say the words failure, but all I feel is this fear of failure, right? This fear of failing their kids, because they have resources. They can pay for their kids, tutoring services and that. So they want to have this best setting for their children. On the other hand, it's also, everything's new to them as well. They never have the same experience, right? So that's very different from their equivalent in American setting, because some of the American setting, then those parents go to boarding school themselves. They went to all these similar process. So they will just do as what they had, or they just reject what they had, right? So it's an easier path in some way. But for these Chinese parents, because China has been changing so quickly in the past decades, so everything's new to them, but they're all also very, afraid with the amount of resources that they have. They're still going to fail their kids. So they keep thinking, what can I do? What services should I buy? Who I should involve into this process so my child will have a better education. Although they will still tell you this ironic story of, I just want my kid to have a happy and free life. But all what they did is not really aiming on that, right? It is almost the opposite of a happy and free life. But the kind of vision they have is still, I don't want my kids to be overwhelmed by exams. So I want them to go to the States so they can play freely, right? They can do sports. They can be more relaxed. But at the end of the day, what they're aiming, when I talk to them, is still Ivy Leagues, right? And if you're going to Ivy Leagues, then you're still planning many things. So as an international student, you can eventually achieve the goal of going to an Ivy League. I think that's actually a pretty helpful angle to rethink this process.
I think that can, we could talk to parents about this and speak to them about this, we can call the micro political economy of life. If you allocate the resources and attention and set goals like this, and then you create lots of stress for yourself, the resources become a curse, right? And also, I think many parents are so anxious because they are winners of the competition, and they are very much afraid that their children will not continue winning, right? Because the competition is still so fierce, and etc. And I think the picture you just gave to us also shows that the deep consequences of inequality. If a society becomes so unequal, it's not only the disadvantaged suffer, but those people who kind of apparently win the game also suffer because they have to create a lot of burden for themselves in this way. So this is just a sort of experiment. I think if the common concern approach be applied in that way, probably there is something to be communicated to them, and then just shed kind of new life to what they are doing.
I think this idea of keep winning is very interesting, right? We all know statistically, if say both parents went to Peking University, it's very unlikely that your
Yes.
kid can happen to also go to Peking University.
It's a basic fact. What people don't believe.
If all parents, if all the couple who went to Peking University, it's impossible statistically that all their kids are going to, this top elite university. But I think in a way, some of them are going these other routes because they don't want their kids to play that game, right? But they still want to win.
Yes.
So they're finding other ways to win this game. In a way, they're trying to provide their kids certain resources so their kids can win without working so hard. But they invented a new game and they don't understand the rule of this new game because it's an American game. And they don't understand how to win that American game, which makes them more anxious in the process. So I think in a way, there is a reckoning that need to be done, that people need to realize they don't have to win. Right? And I think that is probably more an ongoing shared, I would agree that's a common concern for many Chinese, especially well-educated Chinese, not only the parents' generation, even the current, young parents who are in their 20s and 30s, they're usually more educated in any way. They have better social resources, but they also need to decide what do they mean when they say, I want my kid to be happy.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a great conversation. Thank you for joining us and see you next time.
Common Concerns Podcast.